going live now.
Right.
Assume that this is rolling. I always second guess it, and then we have all this fun stuff at the beginning. So, hello everybody. My name is Scott Skiba. I am the Executive Artistic Director for Cleveland Opera Theater, and today is Page to Stage, where we chat with various professionals from around the world and around the country about their process of bringing a production to life from conception, concept, and ideas on the page to the actual production. So today we have with us Eric Einhorn, who is the General and Artistic Director for On-Site Opera in New York City. So welcome, Eric.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Sure.
How's everything going?
Good. We're in the middle of developing a couple of projects
Hmm.
that have been developed in response to what's going on and figuring out, like everybody in the performing arts, how we're going to move forward in all of this.
Just how to survive
Right.
and how to
That's it.
move forward. So I'll ask a couple of questions today. You wear many hats, as a lot of the folks do who've been on here chatting, and so I want to talk a little bit about your work as a general director, as an artistic director, and then also maybe like three levels of the work that you do.
Mhm.
I would say that you work in really large, some of the largest stages in the country. You develop new work, and you also do work that's site specific. So just kind of unpack those things a little bit. So let's talk about that. So for everybody tuning in who might not be savvy to the term site specific, can you explain what is that and how does that relate to your work?
Sure. So site specific is a really general term a lot of the times that people use to typically talk about anything that's not in a traditional theater, that it's performances in a bar or in a warehouse can often be deemed site specific. But what we do is we take the definition of that a little further and a little more literally, in that the pieces we produce and the operas we produce, whether they're new works or pre-existing works, to marry them to a venue and a space to enhance the storytelling.
Hmm.
So the venue we choose is specifically chosen for that particular piece to tell that story the way we want to tell it.
Awesome. So it takes it a step beyond alternative venue and pop-up type of things and actually considers the architecture, the things, and anything that lends itself to the story.
Right, and it adds an immersive element,
Yeah.
which, depending on what what press release you read about on-site, we use both site-specific and immersive as ways to talk about the company.
Hmm.
And the immersion element is much like going to a place like Disney World, where
Hmm.
everything you see around you is curated to help tell the story that the park is trying to tell, and on a certainly much smaller scale. The venues that we choose, and the way the productions are installed in them, are in such a way that it's meant to surround the audience.
Yeah. That might be your new marketing slogan, the Disney of opera. They might have something to say about that.
They might.
So how did you get the idea for something like on-site opera that specializes in this? Where did that start?
So about 9 or 10 years ago, um, I was working as a freelance stage director in different regional companies in the U.S., and I had also spent several years on the directing staff of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And so I was getting a whole lot of experiences on very different levels, all different kinds of budget levels and resources. And being a freelance director, what opportunities weren't being presented to me were those where I could create my own productions. That happens a fair amount in opera and regional opera, but I'd say the majority of the work that directors are doing is on rented scenery with rented costumes, and so there was something missing to the creative fulfillment that I was seeking. It only got me so far in working with someone else's toys, basically.
Yeah.
And I was really looking for a way to just have a different level of artistic fulfillment.
Right.
At the same time, my kids were very young at the time, and I wanted to also find a way to maybe not be traveling for work all the time, and something that would keep me local.
Hmm.
And in looking around and trying to figure out what the best way would be to self-produce anything, in New York, there's no shortage of small opera companies. There are dozens of them, um, performing on small stages in churches and black boxes in small proscenium houses. And adding another one of those companies to the mix just didn't speak to me as much as I wanted it to. So I was looking for what else was a possibility, and I just went back to my theater history classes and being inspired by what a lot of other regional companies were doing at the time, most notably Boston Lyric Opera, about 10 or 15 years ago, had done a whole wonderful series called the Annex series, which was alternative spaces and site-specific productions. And seeing the success that that had kind of inspired me to try it out.
Yeah.
Um, and I also thought at the same time, site-specific might also present a slightly more reasonable financial model. If my space rental and my scenery budget were the same line, then was that a more kind of economically responsible model? Mix that all together with there was not at the time another company strictly producing on a site specific way. So there were a lot of question marks, and so I tiptoed into it very, very slowly.
Nice. I often I wondered this is only a few years ago that Eric and I were roommates in college at Oberlin, and I remember this one time where your assignment, it might have been for Michael Group's class, maybe a scenic design class, where you had to
Oh, right.
check out a space, and there was an old barn, I think, on 57
Yeah.
at a corner, and you went there and spec'd it out and had to figure out how to turn it into a performance venue.
Right.
And so as on-site was taking shape, I
Right.
wondered, oh, I remember that conversation in 1990 back then, and wondered how that played into it. So it's been
Yeah,
great
no,
to see it take shape.
it's that kind of it was that kind of thinking to
Hmm.
look at, because it was a barn that I remember driving by, and that's why when the class assignment happened, I was like, I want to make that barn into a theater because it's a really cool space. I think it's that kind of thinking that's always been on my mind. I love proscenium theaters, don't get me wrong, but the opportunity to work in space differently, to to use what's there, the textures, the feelings of it. I always say that when working on an on-site piece, what what I think resonates a lot with audiences is that you could have the most amazing uh, scenic budget and scenic artists that create something that looks real, but there is something very different about an audience member being able to lean against a wall of a building that is there, has been there, will continue to be there. That just feels different than a well-made piece of scenery. You know one is fake, and you know the other is completely real and will outlive everybody. Maybe not in New York because it'll be redeveloped in 20. But there's just a difference in kind of the experience of it for people that has been really interesting to talk to people about.
Absolutely. There was I don't do as much site specific work as you do, but it's one of the things I love the most. And I had the opportunity to direct the Swan Angelica in
Mm.
Italy in an ancient courtyard that
Mm.
felt
Mm.
like all the things you want. And I just thought that there will never ever be another time when it just feels like we are literally out in the garden under a real tree. She's
Mhm.
pulling off real leaves from things. These are real
Right.
pillars, and then dealing with things like the church bells and the birds. It's just
Right.
a magical time. So
Mhm.
it's been great to follow the kind of work that you're doing. You mentioned combining the scenic budgets with the venue rentals. I imagine that's extra helpful in a place like New York City where venues can be quite costly.
Absolutely. Because if it's one thing I learned through doing this, it's that if anybody has any kind of real estate and usable event space for performances, um, chances are they know it and they're going to charge for it, and they have every right to, because their rent is astronomical and all those things. Um, I,
Do you
I
ever do you have to rent the space and the air now as that becomes more popular and like purchasing the air space?
I think you need to keep that quiet because anybody listening might.
I didn't say that out loud.
My budgets are just going to skyrocket now. Um, Yeah, and I think I entered into it with a naive thought process that I had imagined when I started doing this. There has to be a way to work with spaces that they want to bring the performing arts and opera into their spaces, so they would do it for free, and we could do these partnerships. And that's not to say that hasn't happened. Part of the time, we've had a lot of great partners in museums, especially that have wanted to bring in different kind of programming, and we've done a sort of co-production model or a rent-free model, basically,
Mhm.
and it's been great. But we've performed in a lot of event spaces and a lot of smaller sorts of businesses that the way a lot of these places make their money, they're either wedding spaces or they are film locations. Um, so so
And
you
those budgets are they can be very different. I know that there's we've done a couple of annual productions in a warehouse space. Shout out to Red Space in Cleveland.
Mhm.
Really cool venue, but you know when we're doing work in there, it can be a little different because an event usually comes in the morning and they're gone. And when we're looking for a 4 day window to put up all the truss and
Mhm.
set up everything, sometimes you don't get that luxury. What's the smallest turnaround time that you've had in a venue before the audience walks in?
2.5 hours,
That's
I think
great.
is what it was. It was our third production.
Mhm.
We did Rameau's Pygmalion at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in Times Square. And very much as you described, they're an event space. They're used to things coming in quickly and setting up. And the in order to keep costs down, they said, we'll shorten the window and you can come in late and then just open the doors, do the show, and be out. It was a pretty low setup, and that's always what we do. We have a pretty small footprint by design so that we have a quick in and out time, but also so we're not installing platforming and too much equipment, that we want to use the space as it is as much as possible.
Mhm.
But it was pretty nerve wracking to be setting up chairs and getting the orchestra set up, and all within this tiny window. And in that window was which is one story that I have told ad nauseum about sort of the price of doing site specific business. Um, with such a short load in window, we found out very too late, really. There had always been this background music playing in the particular room in the museum where we were going to perform. And I was assured that when performance time came, they were going to turn the music off. It's going to be fine, not a problem. But what we learned half an hour, 45 minutes before the performance was that the music was covering massive air handling systems that, of course, are necessary to regulate the temperature in a wax museum.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, of all the pieces we were doing this very crystalline French Baroque one act with very light orchestration, players playing on period instruments with gut strings, and Baroque singers against a windmill. Uh, so you learn all sorts of things.
Is that, I'm sure you have a list now, a checklist of, like warning labels on products. They exist because someone has tried it. So you,
Exactly.
you probably have a list now of warnings and procedures and protocols that most people who produce wouldn't even think of, but you've had to deal with it 2 hours before or during or something like that.
Right. Like what is the air conditioning like? What are the pathways for artists? What are the dressing room situations?
Mhm.
What is the electrical load possible within a historic space when you're having to bring in anything?
Right.
A curling iron for hair and makeup, things like that. Yeah, all sorts of things.
So do you sort of have a wish list of spaces around New York, or now that you're rising up in popularity, are people reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, on site, come here and do opera with us"?
Yes, uh, as we continue to produce and uh, put ourselves out there, the tables have turned a little bit.
Mhm.
In the beginning of all of this, I would go to a venue with a packet of papers and a plan, and given the hard sell, please will you let me rent your space? And I can recall frequently in these meetings, the question back at me was, well, what's in it for me?
Hmm.
What, why should I let you rent the space? It's not for a use that I intend. It's not what our space does, and you really have to finesse that and convince them and let them know that it's going to be great for everybody. But as time has gone on, when we've had good reviews, when we have a much bigger following, when I can now turn to venues and say, well, some of the wedding venues we performed in have actually gotten weddings booked because of our audience, because they come and see the space and they want to book it for themselves. So there's a real one helping the other kind of thing.
Yeah,
And now organizations and venues are coming to us asking for us to come in and engage with their spaces, which is really exciting.
yeah, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, I find we do a lot of alternative venue work, and
Mm.
I've discovered spaces because of going to a wedding, or
Mm.
or
Yeah.
you patrons have come, and sometimes people will come who normally wouldn't come to see opera, but they walked through. We were doing something in the arcade downtown on Fourth Street, and people were walking through, going to and from the Browns game as we
Mm.
were like loading in that morning for the show that night. And
Mm.
they didn't stay for the whole opera, but people stopped and cheered and clapped and just kind of
Exactly.
discovered it in a way that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Do you find anything different in your process, bringing the performance to life, if it's an indoor space it's a little more controlled versus something that's outdoor where you might have some passerbys?
Yeah, I've learned to be a lot less precious with what it is we do. That before doing site specific work, when you're in rehearsal and when you're in tech rehearsals and anything before opening can have this clandestine feeling to it.
Yeah.
Nobody can come in, and when there are visitors, at a lot of opera companies, company management will ask permission to bring, of course, members of the press, but also donors and things, anybody to observe the process um, while it's happening. But with site specific stuff, I've now worked in a lot of venues where a stipulation of the partnership is, well, we can't close down this space that you're in. So people are going to walk by and do what they do. And it's just got to be what it is. And sometimes that slows you down because people, God bless them, you could be in the middle of rehearsal and they'll just kind of come up to you and say, what's going on?
We
And
need to turn the lights on right now. Oh.
right. And so I think it's a really great opportunity to take ourselves a little less seriously and realize we're just playing pretend.
Yeah,
And if somebody's interested in that, how amazing is that?
exactly. Yeah, and you never, there's always a chance to maybe engage somebody in it. Just
Hmm.
they wouldn't otherwise have stumbled on it, but
Right.
somehow they did.
Absolutely.
Um, I imagine there are a lot of things that could go into this, but just briefly, what's different about, you're directing a production at the Met, or you're directing a production at Lyric Opera Chicago, like two huge auditoriums, huge stages, all the bells and whistles, all the things.
Mhm.
As a director, as a storyteller, what's different about that approach of saying, all right, here I am preparing, and I've got my score and either maybe your model and things like
Mhm.
that. Is there anything that differs in the process?
The fundamental answer is, for me, no. That there are some directors who I think are spectacle minded
Hmm.
and stage picture minded. Um, People like Franco Zeffirelli, sort of the quintessential spectacular stage designer and stage picture creator. And it's not to say the characters that he created in his productions aren't rich and complex, but as a designer first, that's sort of what he led with. I'm somebody that, regardless of how many people are on stage, it's for me always got to be about the people, all about text and music and that relationship. Um, and so whether it's 6 people in an on-site show or 300 people on the Met stage in a big warhorse, it's all got to come from the same place. Because that's, I think, how that's how I try to approach everybody doing their best work is to get them all on that same level. Um, and spatially, there's of course the difference when you're talking about site specific, because oftentimes you're looking at audiences in non-traditional arrangements. So people are looking at the space differently, whether it's in the round or three-quarter or something strange in between, versus the Met or Chicago Lyric, where you're getting the letterbox of the stage picture. But all that said, 3 or 4 years ago, I directed a production of Puritani at Lyric in Chicago, and there was it was the beginning of Act 3, where there's a big storm scene and lots of comings and goings. And I couldn't leave well enough alone. I just couldn't sort of wrap my head around what to do with it in a traditional sense. And so there were all these supers and soldiers and people hunting for the tenor. And I couldn't, like I said, couldn't leave well enough alone. And so I took people off stage, and people through this 6 or 7 minute storm scene, people were running through the auditorium. We lit the auditorium. We brought the storm light out. The amazing tenor Larry Brownlee was wonderfully game. I said, Larry, you're going to come in through the auditorium. You're going to start singing your aria in the auditorium, and then go up on stage. And he was game. And so it's moments like that that I found to kind of bring my two worlds together in a really interesting way, because I think audiences are game for it. They you can stretch things now in a way that people just go with you on it.
Yeah, and sort of sometimes you do things out of necessity, and it ends up being like oh wow, that was a moment that stood out to everybody, or a lot of people commented on the chorus coming in here, or this character running through here, or taking this from the orchestra pit, that just different things that they can do. And I think it's definitely a really challenging time for everybody, and not making light of it in any way, but I think I'm a silver lining type of person. And one of the silver linings I'm trying to find and see is that it seems like this time especially, we're open to exploring some things. Like you said, a lot of times the art form can feel precious or overly protected, or there's like so many rules. But I think now it's sort of like there's a little bit of freedom, where it's not going to be as polished. It's a little more exploratory.
Yeah.
How are you handling some of this stuff? I mean, for performances of yours that say could be outside or somewhere where maybe transmission of particles and vaporized droplets and things like that aren't as much of a concern. Are you looking at things like that? Are you kind of playing it by ear? I know you're in a really unique situation being in New York City. So what do you have up your sleeve?
Yeah, it's as you said, being in New York City, where of all the counties in New York, we will probably be the final one to open based on the governor's criterion for opening, and then performing arts. Even if we are given permission to open, how we then do that is the question on everybody's mind, whether it's the Met or Broadway or small opera companies. My big concern is that transmission possibility. And there's of course relatively new data out there about the potential transmission power of classical singing, and that it creates the need for even further distances and things like that. And I struggle because what I speculate and what I've seen sort of anecdotally to be true is that even outside, when you hear live music, and I've seen it posted on various social media platforms, if you create a space where you're singing 6 or 10 feet away, people gravitate towards it anyway. And unless you're going to have strict enforcement through extra staffing and physical barriers, I think you're going to be hard pressed to create the adequate amount of distance. And that creates a real ethical dilemma for me, not only for the audience members, but for the singers. And no aria, no opera, no piece of music is worth getting sick over. And so we've actually turned away from currently thinking about any kind of um, outdoor performance that would bring anybody together. I mean, even singers, like I don't even know how anybody would come together to rehearse right now.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, there's so much is unknown.
right.
I know we're all, in the community, probably collectively crossing our fingers and doing whatever we can to hopefully wake up and say, "Oh, wait, this is now known or this is
Right.
possible." But it's a really it's scary because you want to be on the forefront and feed the
Mhm.
need for the art form and
Mhm.
welcome people back, but at the same time, you don't want to risk anyone's health. And there's so
Right.
many different considerations, even when they were talking about, well, if the wind is favorably in this direction, and you think, well, it's either
Mhm.
favorable for the performers or the audience, but you can't get the wind to blow both
Right.
directions.
Exactly.
So it's just a lot to consider.
And nobody wants to be the guinea pig. People, like you said, people want to be there for their audiences and provide the art that people are craving, but nobody wants to be that first company of any art form where you have a massive outbreak because you brought people together.
Right. Yeah, and I'm excited for the time maybe to see how we lean into these things.
Hmm.
And I know you've
Yeah.
done a lot of pioneering work with that. You've got a great app
Hmm.
for the phone. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that was pretty exciting to see that be developed.
Yeah. So we technology has always been something that we've played around with. To seeing if there are ways that we can streamline our producing model and incorporate tech into performances in an organic way. Excuse me. And in this same production of Pygmalion at the Wax Museum, we instituted a test of Google Glass at the time when being a site specific company where actions happening all over the place, using smart glasses, which would put the super titles in the field of vision so
Yeah.
you could follow it wherever you went, was really exciting. And it proved really useful and as a real potential for adoption. But then Google pulled the tech from the market
Hmm.
and we were left without anything. And several years went by. Um, and in a lot of places, we just didn't deal with super titles because the venues didn't um, support anywhere to project them, or it was too expensive to sort of bring in the equipment.
Hmm.
Until finally, at one Opera America conference several years ago, there was an exhibitor display by a company called Instant Encore, which has been around for years and was sort of a leader in um, digital programs and developing branded apps for nonprofit arts groups as a way to engage with their customers, whether it was through digital programs or buying tickets as a way to augment their websites, things like that. And the branding was really great. And we never really had a need for it because of our size. But then they had developed a new module for it in tandem with the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was this module called Live Note, which was created to deliver real-time program notes during an orchestral concert. But they also, of course, were starting to market it to the opera community for super titles.
Hmm.
And being a small, agile company, and the price point was really actually quite doable, even for a small company, we were able to adopt it within 4 months, roll it out um, to a production, and we've had incredible success with it. Audiences have really loved it. We've started to do multiple languages for things. We did a show with English and Spanish titles. We did a show with English and Japanese titles. It's been really wonderful for us, and it's also a way to engage with our patrons. It's a way to stay connected, gather some very critical data on them and with them to sort of gauge their experience and just stay connected.
Yeah. No, it sounds great. It sounds like a great platform. I have yet to be able to attend a production live, so I'm got my fingers
One
crossed.
day, one day.
Your work is always great. I know, and we keep talking about the confluence in Cleveland. One day your schedule will allow you to be there at some point. We'll get to do some cool stuff.
Absolutely.
But before I let you go, have you turned into like a professional quarantine baker or developed any superpowers or skills? 10-pack abs now in quarantine.
um, I've gotten over a lot of fear in the kitchen, certainly
Hmm.
through quarantine, um, and I'm able to exercise all of my um, just mildly obsessive compulsive behaviors through lots of house cleaning and tidying up and keeping my universe neat and tidy.
Well, if it clears up for visitation, you can come over here and do some cleaning.
Will do. Happy to do it.
Well, Eric, thank you for making time today. Thanks for sharing all the insight into all the exciting and unique work that you do and taking time to join us here.
Thanks for
Hope
having
that
me.
everything is as good as it can be and hang in there. Look forward to seeing you soon.
You too.
All right, I miss you and thank you everybody for tuning in. Hope you all have a great day and we will be in touch. Thank you.